Let's address the elephant in the room. The ugly stepchild of magic that no one seems to like. The color that is attributed to the phrase weenie. Magic the Gathering was designed with a 1v1, 20 life play in mind. The first format, or the only format back in Magic's conception, was what we would think of today as Standard, where there are two opponents, bring pre-constructed 60 card decks and a 15 card sideboard with a limit of 4 of each card and battle it out to see who wins, in either the best of 1 or a best of 3. All of the colors in Magic were designed with this concept in mind, so they were fairly balanced with one another. The format that we all know and love today, that's arguably Magic's cash cow, is the most inclusive way to play, Commander, or Elder Dragon Highlander, was being played all the way back in 1996 with the original Elder Dragon cards, but Wizards of the Coast made their first official Commander decks in 2011. It is no secret that 2 out of the 5 colors in Magic seem to struggle in the format of EDH. But what if I told you that Wizards of the Coast has been putting in the time, sweat, and your money to try and shift the balance of power that we've all previously known? Today, I'm going to tell you why you should play mono white. First of all, before we move into the rest of the video, I just want to give a big thank you to you guys, my subscribers, just my general viewers. As of recording this video, we are almost at 450 subscribers, so I would really love it if we can make the push to 500, and my ultimate goal is 1,000. So I just want to say thank you for your views, likes, comments, subscriptions, everything. I eagerly await replying to your comments. I love seeing the interaction from you guys, just talking about your favorite cards, your favorite things in Commander, things that you liked about the videos. So I do try and take everything that I hear, being good or bad. Some constructive criticism is always appreciated. So we'll move into the rest of the video, but I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you. I'm your friendly blue mage, Azoreign. Welcome back to the channel if you're returning, and welcome to the channel if you're a new viewer. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Leave a comment saying why you think white is the best color, or don't, I'm not your dad. Anyway, going off of my own experience with the format, the color pie definitely seems to be unbalanced. As I've mentioned in my previous videos, why you should play mono blue, black, and green, those colors have great ways to interact with the game, like how mono black can use spells to reanimate most anything, blue spells specialize in drawing extra cards and certainly telling people no, and green kind of does a bit of everything, but it's known for its many ways to ramp up mana. That leaves 2 colors behind their siblings. White likes to focus on having board presence with many small creatures that can efficiently block bigger creatures and allow you to swing with a go-wide army of tiny little pingers. But this strategy does not seem very good in a new format that limits you to 1 copy of any card. Players have double their usual life total, and there are 2 extra players at the table. So how has Wizards of the Coast addressed this issue where 2 of their 5 colors seem to be outmatched in every way when playing EDH? When building my Commander decks, I always like to lay out the areas that I need to make sure to hit when I'm playing an actual game. And these areas, in my own personal ranking, are the first one is ramp, whether that's artifacts or extra lands, but it's how am I going to play multiple spells in a turn, or how am I going to play bigger, more impactful spells earlier in the game. Number 2 is card draw. How am I going to gain card advantage as the game progresses? 3, removal. How am I going to answer threats that are going to kill me or stop me from executing my game plan before I can win? Number 4, how am I going to win? Whether this is from a combo, combat damage, mass damage spells, whatever you prefer, finding out this method and narrowing down how you plan to win can help you craft your end game cards. And number 5 is the fun stuff. I believe that Commander is a format unlike any other in Magic, and it allows us to pull cards from throughout the game's history that doesn't always need to be the most efficient. I love to throw in pet cards or cards that I just love the art of, gorgeous foils that I might have pulled or have in my collections, and just things that I like to see in my hand because I think they're neat, not because they're the most efficient way to play the game. But with that being said, let's just jump right into answering these pivotal deck building questions regarding mono white. And we're going to start off with section 1 being ramp. Now you might not believe me when I say this, but mono white has actually gotten the second most land ramp support behind mono green in recent years. Wizards of the Coast has done a great job in providing cards that fetch land in mono white, but white being white definitely needs to hit some requirements before we can just go get extra lands like green allows us to do. Some of the most notable extra land cards in mono white are things like Land Tax, where it's 1 mana for an enchantment at the beginning of our upkeep. If an opponent controls more lands than us, we can search our library for 3 basic land cards and reveal them and put them into our hand. So this doesn't necessarily ramp us, but it allows us to do a couple things. It gets lands out of our deck, so we don't have to worry about drawing them when we don't need them. And it just says basic lands, so usually white restricts us to things like plains cards, but this can be put in 3-color decks, 4-color decks, whatever you want, but it can just grab us lands. We can discard them if we don't need them, but we're always going to make sure to have lands. Usually land tax you don't want to be going first if you have it in your hand in the early game, but land tax is definitely a mono white staple. Next up are things like Boreas Charger, Knight of the White Orchid, and Core Cartographer. Boreas Charger, when it leaves the battlefield, choose an opponent who controls more lands than you. Search your library for a number of plains cards equal to the difference. Reveal those cards, put one of them on the battlefield tapped and the rest into your hand and then shuffle. So Boreas Charger is basically, it's got flying. It's very weak, so it's going to make sure to die. It's not going to be able to just jump anything. It's pretty much going to take a hit even if we block a 1/1 token. And we get to search for the difference in lands. So if an opponent controls 6 lands and we control 3, we get to go search for 3 and we put 1 out tapped, which seems pretty efficient to do in white. Knight of the White Orchid is classic. It's a 2/2 with first strike. When Knight of the White Orchid enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands, you go and search for a plains, put it on the battlefield. And the Core Cartographer, when Core Cartographer enters the battlefield, you search for a plains, put it onto the battlefield, tapped, and shuffle. The Core Cartographer is 4 mana, only gets us 1 land, so you can kind of see, and that land enters tapped, but you can just see how inefficient these white land tutors are when things like Cultivate exist, where it grabs a land to the field and a land to your hand, being 3 mana, and Core Cartographer is 4 mana for 1 land to the field tapped. But the thing that I do want to note about these cards is that they say plains cards, so if we have things like shock lands, we can go and grab those plains cards, so they don't have to be, they don't say basic land. Moving on, we have cards like Cartographer's Hawk and Loyal Warhound. The Cartographer's Hawk is a 2/1 with flying. When Cartographer's Hawk deals combat damage to a player who controls more lands than you, return the Hawk to its owner's hand. If you do, you may search your library for a plains card, put it on the battlefield tapped. Loyal Warhound is a 3/1 with vigilance. When Loyal Warhound enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic. This is important. Search your library for a basic plains card to put on the battlefield tapped. So the Loyal Warhound, doesn't get us any plains we want. It still enters tapped, but again, where the Cartographer's Hawk needs to deal damage to get that trigger, the Loyal Warhound just gets that right when it enters. Next are going to be Verge Rangers, Archaeomancer's Map, and Space Marine Scout. Verge Rangers is a 3/3 with first strike. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, so we do not play with it revealed, so only we know this. As long as an opponent controls more lands than you, you may play lands from the top of your library. So a very cool white Oracle of Moldiah, which is pretty sweet. Space Marine Scout came in the Warhammer decks. First strike vigilance, and when Space Marine Scout enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a plains card, battlefield tapped. I feel like I'm repeating that a lot in this early section. But the next is going to be one of my favorite mono white ramps, which is known as the mono white Cultivate, Archaeomancer's Map, so 3 mana. When Archaeomancer's Map enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 2 basic plains cards, reveal them, put them in your hand. When a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player controls more lands than you, you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So it's kind of like a burgeoning. You go and you get the lands to your hand so you can have them, and then when an opponent plays a land, you're in mono white, so they're probably going to have more lands than you, but then we just get to play a land. We get to get our lands out for free. So Archaeomancer's Map is going to make sure that we can hit our land drop for the turn when we cast it, and then hopefully we can play that second one that we got for free, so then we'll actually be up on lands. The next ones we're going to talk about is Keeper of the Accord, Scholar of New Horizons, and Stoic Farmer. Keeper of the Accord does quite a few things for us, so it's a 3/4 for 4. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more creatures than you, create a 1/1 white soldier. And at the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more lands than you may search your library for a basic plains, put on the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle. So this is going to make sure that we have creatures going, and it's going to make sure that we get our lands out. So Keeper of the Accord, it's not going to trigger the turn we cast it because it's only on opponent's end steps, but I mean, this card can just get you a land out. It can get 3 lands out. The turn you play it, it goes around the table. You get 3 lands out by the start of your next turn. The Scholar of New Horizons is interesting. It's a 1/1 for 2. Scholar of New Horizons enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it. You tap the Scholar, remove a counter from a permanent you control, search your library for a plains card, reveal it. If an opponent controls more lands than you may put that card onto the battlefield tapped. And if you don't, you put it in your hand, obviously. So this card is interesting with strategies like +1/+1 counter, or even things like sagas. So if you play any sort of sagas, especially in mono white, I know that there's a few of them that you could probably include into your deck. The Scholar of New Horizons can remove a counter from those sagas or your creatures and ramp you up some lands. The Stoic Farmer, when Stoic Farmer enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic plains card and reveal it. If an opponent controls more lands than you, guess what you get to do? Put it on the battlefield. But you can also foretell the Stoic Farmer, so you can pay 2 colorless and then you put it in your little foretell pile, and then it only costs 1 in a white. So seems pretty good. If you can put this aside, get it out of your hand, cast it for cheaper later. And the last 3 that we are going to talk about is the Restoration of Iganjo, I think is how you pronounce that, Deep Gnome Terramancer, and Aerial Surveyor. So the Restoration is a saga, just like I was talking about with the Scholar of New Horizons. So the first thing we cast it goes to its first saga counter, lore counter, whatever they're called. Search your library for a basic plains, reveal it, put it in your hand. Number 2, you may discard a card, and when you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And 3, exile this, and then you can transform it. So I'm not going to talk about the backside because that's not really what I'm talking about, but it's a vigilant thing that makes tokens. So the step 1 is going to find us that plains that we can cast. Step 2 is a little bit of reanimation, which is nice. And then the step 3, it turns into a creature that makes other creatures. So this just seems really efficient for mono white. And the Deep Gnome Terramancer is pretty sweet. So it's a 2 mana, 2/2 with flash. Whenever 1 or more lands enter the battlefield under an opponent's control without being played, you may search your library for a plains card. Put it on the battlefield tap. Do this only once each turn. So just like I said, when someone casts their Cultivate or their Farseek, whatever green ramp they're going to cast, and they put a land out without playing it for the turn, Deep Gnome Terramancer is going to trigger only once, but still. They ramp, you're happy, you're still in the game. And the last one, Aerial Surveyor. So this is a vehicle with flying. It's a 3/4. Whenever Aerial Surveyor attacks, if the defending player has more lands than you, search your library for basic plains, put it on the battlefield, tapped. It's crew 2. Pretty easy to hit that crew cost. It's a 3/4 with flying, so it's actually a pretty big body in the air. It's cheap. It's 3 mana. It's a good return on power and toughness, and it's going to ramp us lands. So Aerial Surveyor is pretty cool. And next up, I have this section called the other section. So these aren't necessarily things that are going to ramp us lands, but I definitely need to talk about these. So these cards are things like Monologue Tax, Smuggler's Share, Smothering Tithe, and Weathered Wayfarer. Now I know this section is definitely the all-stars of mono white, but let's just get into it. So Monologue Tax is a 3 mana enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, you create a treasure, so the little brother of Smothering Tithe. Smuggler's Share, again 3 mana. At the beginning of each end step, draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn. Then create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield this turn. So Smuggler's Share can just do a lot. It's gonna, and notice how it says each opponent drew cards this turn. So let's say an opponent casts a spell with flash and they draw a couple cards. You will also get to draw cards, and then the opponent whose turn it was drew a couple cards, you get to draw more cards, and you're making more treasures. So Smuggler's Share is kind of this in-between of Monologue Tax and Smothering Tithe. Smothering Tide, the boogeyman of Commander, I probably don't need to talk about this card, but just in case you don't know what it does, 4 mana, it is the big brother to things like Rhystic Study, so whenever an opponent draws a card, they may pay 2. If they don't, you create a treasure token. So this card is extremely busted and should be in any deck that is white. And lastly, Weathered Wayfarer. So 1 mana, 1/1. You pay 1 white and you tap the Weathered Wayfarer. Search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it in your hand. Activate only if an opponent controls more lands than you. So this is nice because we can go and get any land that we want. It can be colorless, it can be our utility lands. It doesn't have to be a Plains card. Weathered Wayfarer is pretty classic, and it's just going to make sure that you hit your land drops later in the game. It's cheap, its activation is cheap, and it puts a land right in your hand. And lastly, we're going to talk about some cool artifacts that you can run in white. So this section isn't really big. Again, you can run your Gilded Lotus, your Thran Dynamos, your Arcane Cygnus, whatever you want, but these are going to be specifically the things for white. So things like Gold Mirror, I'm a big fan of the mirror cards in monocolored decks, so it's a 2 mana 1/1 that just taps for a white. The Gatewatch Beacon, which is a new card that came out in Commander Masters, so it's 3 mana. Gatewatch Beacon enters the battlefield with 3 loyalty counters on it. You tap and add a white. When a Planeswalker enters the battlefield under your control, if Gatewatch Beacon has a loyalty counter on it, you may move a loyalty counter from Gatewatch Beacon onto that Planeswalker. So, we could be playing some Gideons, some Elspeths. This card, it acts just like Commander Sphere, and if we are playing with some sort of Planeswalker sub-theme, it can add some loyalty counters on. Wand of the World Soul, 2 and a white. Wand of the World Soul enters the battlefield tapped. You tap and add a white, or you can tap it and the next spell you cast this turn has Convoke. So it gives any of our spells Convoke. We're in mono white, so we're probably going to be pumping out a lot of small creatures anyway. So Wand of the World Soul can actually help us multi-spell earlier. It gives us mana the next turn after we cast it because that enters tapped, but then it can also give our big spells Convoke, so we can get our big angels or whatever we're going to cast earlier. And lastly is Oketra's Monument. So this actually doesn't tap for mana, but I still count it in the artifact ramp section because it says white creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 warrior with Vigilance, which is pretty sweet. So this 1/1 warrior can attack, and if we have Wand of the World Soul out, we can use our 1/1 warriors to convoke spells out. Oketra's Monument is a ramp little cost reducer, and it's going to make us bodies. What we want to do in white is go wide. So you can see in the recent years, white has been given an abundance of way to get extra lands out onto the battlefield. Most of these ways need a requirement to be met before you can just go and get an extra land, but most ways often bring the land in tapped, so it isn't reliable on the turn you ramp it, but it is getting you extra lands out to use later in the game, something that red, black, and blue really don't have access to. So after our ramp is set aside, I like to next address card draw in my decks. And this is going to be things, mono white's best card draw spell ever, Esper Sentinel. So whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player plays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. So especially if we're putting counters on the Esper Sentinel, that cost is going to go up, but even 1 mana, this thing is comparable to Rhystic Study, which we all know how annoying and painful that card is. Esper Sentinel, 1 mana, 1/1. Draw you some cards. This thing, I have played this. It has been hated off the table anytime I play this, so that should just tell you how good this card is, and it should definitely be in any deck that you have that contains white, being only 1 white mana. Next up is going to be Mesa Enchantress, so 1 white white. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you draw a card. Pretty self-explanatory, but if we're it's EDH, we're going to be running some enchantments. I don't know if you want to run this card if you're not running a lot of enchantments, but I wanted to talk about it because it says draw a card. Secret Rendezvous, so for 1 white white, you and target opponent each draw 3 cards. So this you can use politically. You can help the player who's in last place, or you can say, hey, I just want to draw some cards, I want to get some favor with someone. Maybe you give it to a player with a pretty strong commander or who's had a pretty strong start. You can give them a little boost to get some heat off of you, or you can help a struggling player. Next up is Archivist of Ogma, so Flash. Whenever an opponent searches their library, you may gain 1 life and draw a card. So a lot of library searching happens in EDH, and this card could draw you an abundance of cards with 3 other opponents. Mangara the Diplomat, so 4 mana for a 2/4 with lifelink. Whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, It's a weird way to say that. If 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you and or a planeswalker you control, you draw a card. And whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, draw a card. So Mangar just, it's got some protection on. Well, it doesn't have protection, but he gives us insurance of if we're attacked, we get to maybe draw some answers. And if someone is just popping off casting multiple spells, we also get to draw some cards. And the next section is going to be things like Court Spirit Dancer, Saram Senior Edificer, and Pure Steel Paladin, which all have something similar to whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. So the Spirit Dancer is aura spells, the Pure Steel Paladin is equipment, and the Paladin also has Metalcraft. So if you control 3 or more artifacts, equipment have equip 0, which can actually be pretty important in EDH. And lastly, we're going to talk about Welcoming Vampire and Mentor the Meek. Classic mono white cards. The Welcoming Vampire. Whenever 1 or more other creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability only triggers once, so we're kind of limited, whereas Mentor the Meek says whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, we may pay 1 and draw a card, so we can at least repeat that effect on Mentor the Meek. And for the last card, I wanted to talk about Dawn of Hope. Whenever you gain life, you may pay 2 mana if you do draw a card. It does have another ability. It creates a soldier with lifelink, but that's not really important. It is 2 mana. It's a little expensive, but in mono white, we're looking to draw as many cards as we can in as many ways as we can. So I needed to talk about Dawn of Hope because we're also the color of lifelink or just incidentally gaining life. So I figured that Dawn of Hope would be a pretty good add here. And the next section that goes along with card draw is I wanted to talk about tutors, which mono white actually has quite a bit of access to, with things like Enlightened Tutor, search our library for an artifact or enchantment, reveal it, put it on the top for 1 mana, pretty nice. Or it's got things like Academy Rector for 4 mana. When Academy Rector is put into a graveyard, you may remove Academy Rector from the game. If you do, search your library for an enchantment card and put it onto the battlefield. So Academy Rector is pretty famous in mono white, and it's very powerful as it gets it right out onto the battlefield for us. Stoneforge Mystic and Stonehewer Giant. So Stoneforge Mystic, again, another really classic mono white card. When Stoneforge Mystic enters the battlefield, you may search a library for an equipment card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle your library. We can also pay 2 mana, 1 and a white, tap the Stoneforge Mystic, and we can put an equipment from our hand onto the battlefield. And the Stonehewer Giant's kind of similar, so it's 3 white, so it's way more expensive, but it's a 4/4 with Vigilance. 1 and a white, search your library for an equipment card and put it onto the battlefield. Attach it to a creature you control so it gets around equip costs. It does need to tap itself, but it's got Vigilance, so maybe we could go to combat before. It's more expensive than the Stoneforge Mystic, but it also gets things right out. So you can see how powerful that would be if we're running pretty expensive equipments. Next up is Idyllic Tutor, 3 mana, search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, put it in your hand. So more expensive than Enlightened Tutor, but it only gets enchantments, but it goes to our hand instead of the top of our library. Oswald Fiddlebender is a 2 mana 2/2 with Magical Tinkering, so 1 white and tap Oswald, sacrifice an artifact, search your library for an artifact card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrifice mana value of the artifact, and you put it onto the battlefield. So again, just getting around putting it on the top of our library, putting it to our hand, we're going to get something right out to the battlefield, and Oswald can make sure that we can turn our little things into bigger things. Next up is Recruiter of the Guard and Ranger Captain of Eos. When Recruiter of the Guard enters the battlefield, search your library for a creature card with toughness 2 or less, reveal it, put it in your hand. And the Ranger Captain of Eos, they're both 3 mana. When Ranger Captain of Eos enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost 1 or less, reveal it, put it in your hand. Sacrifice Ranger Captain of Eos. Your opponents can't cast non-creature spells this turn. So Ranger Captain is just gonna, he does a lot. He does only grab little tiny creatures, but I mean, if we're in mono white, so we can grab Giver of Runes or Mother of Runes to protect our creatures, and then he can be used later to stop any non-creature spells. So if we don't want something getting countered, or if someone, you know, they have like a big artifact loaded up or something game breaking, the Ranger Captain can just stop all of that. Next up is going to be Open the Armory and Steel Shaper's Gift. Search your library for an aura or equipment, reveal it, put it in your hand. Pretty self-explanatory. Steel Shaper's Gift. Search your library for an equipment card, reveal it, and put it in your hand. So these 2 cards are just super similar. And lastly, we're going to talk about Arena Rector and Search for Glory. Arena Rector is very similar to Academy Rector, And when a Redirector dies, you may exile. If you do, search your library for a Planeswalker and put it on the battlefield. And search for glory, search your library for a snow, a legendary, or a saga. Reveal it, put it in your hand. So search for glory, I feel like, is not talked about enough. It grabs quite a few different things. I don't know how many snow permanents we're running, but it can grab a legendary card, so that means legendary land, creature, enchantment, whatever we have that's legendary. Or sagas. So again, if we're running sagas to combo with the Scholar of New Horizons, search for glory is going to make sure to go and get those when we need them. And next up is something that white is known for and has only gotten better over the years. It's access to removal. Just as black uses spells that destroy, blue bounces, red burns, white specializes in exiling, which is arguably the best kind of removal, because it will deny your opponents the chance to get access to those cards once they're in the graveyard. And I'm definitely talking to you, Muldrotha players. So let's go ahead and talk about white's removal. So we have things like Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, and Darksteel Mutation. Now, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time breaking all these cards down because they should be pretty self-explanatory. You probably play them or have seen them in a lot of your commander games. So Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile are both 1-mana instants. They allow your opponents to do different things like gain life or search their libraries. Darksteel Mutation's a 2-mana enchantment. It can be pretty hefty when you enchant their commander. So it doesn't exile their commander, so they can't move their commander back to the command zone. And it makes it a 0/1 indestructible beetle that loses all other abilities and card types and whatnot. So it's pretty hard to get around someone's commander being enchanted with this. And next up, I wanted to talk about Fateful Absence and Declaration in Stone, because they both depict Sorin and they give off similar vibes. So the Fateful Absence, destroy target creature or planeswalker, its controller investigates. Declaration in Stone. Now, I've always thought this card is kind of cool to handle big token strategies. Exile target creature and all other creatures its controller controls with the same name as that creature. That player investigates for each non-token creature exiled this way. So let's say I've lost a few times to people just making infinite Thopters or infinite soldiers or whatever, and they're little 1/1 tokens, and they can use them to deal infinite damage. And use Declaration in Stone. It is a sorcery, but it just gets rid of all of those, and especially if they're tokens, they don't get to investigate. So I've always thought that Declaration in Stone is really valuable in that way. But we're going to move on and talk about Oblation, Banishing Light, Minimus Containment, and Oblivion Ring. So Oblation is kind of weird. It's like white's Chaos Warp. The owner of target non-land permanent shuffles it into their library and then draws 2 cards, so arguably this could be almost stronger than a Chaos Warp, because Chaos Warp gives them a free permanent, hypothetically, and Oblation just allows them to draw 2 cards. But things like Banishing Light, Minimus Containment, and Oblivion Ring are enchantments that are going to enter the battlefield and make something leave. The Minimus Containment does make it into a treasure, so they can sacrifice it and get it into their graveyard. But I just thought it was interesting because Oblivion Ring and Banishing Light exile something until those enchantments leave. The Minimus Containment turns it into a treasure, so your opponent does ramp up a little bit, but it's still something to note. And last up in this section, we're going to talk about Generous Gift, which is white's Beast Within. So you destroy a permanent, and its controller creates a 3/3 elephant instead of that beast. Next up, we are going to talk about things that get multiple permanents. So things like Grasp of Fate, Council's Judgment, and Dismantling Wave. Grasp of Fate, when it enters for each opponent, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent until Grasp of Fate leaves. Council's Judgment does the same thing. Starting with you, each player votes for a non-land permanent you don't control and exile each permanent with the most votes, or tied for the most votes. So this can be really political. It can either be used to get the most threatening thing off the battlefield, or one person loses something, well, they don't want to be the only one who loses something, so they want to make sure that everybody loses something, and the votes just start going around the table. And it's pretty fun to introduce voting cards into a game of Magic. And lastly is Dismantling Wave. So these are all 3 mana. For each opponent, destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment that player controls. But we can also cycle it for 6 white, and when we cycle it, we discard this and then draw. When you cycle Dismantling Wave, destroy all artifacts and enchantments. So it does hurt us, but kind of cool that it's got 2 modes on it. And next up, we are going to talk about arguably what white is the best at, and that is going to be its many, many board wipes. So bear with me, I'm just going to kind of fly through this section because, again, all of these pretty much just say destroy everything or exile everything or whatever. So we're going to talk about Wrath of God, Day of Judgment, Hallowed Burial, Terminus, Austerior Command, Planar Cleansing, Rout, Cleansing Nova, Farewell, Vanquish the Horde, Hour of Revelation, Doomscar, Depopulate, Fumigate, and Elspeth, Sun's Champion. There's just so much here. All of these, like I said, either say destroy creatures, exile all creatures. One that I want to talk about as well is a newer one called Sunfall, which exiles all creatures and then allows us to incubate. So we get to incubate X, and it's just going to allow us to get back into the game more quickly. Yeah, a lot of these pretty self-explanatory. Things like Vanquish the Horde can be reduced, Doomscar can be foretold, Hour of Revelation is interesting, it costs 3 less if there are 10 or more non-land permanents out. Farewell is obviously super hated because it exiles a bunch of things. We can make sure to keep our, artifacts or enchantments and then exile other things. Rout can be casted at flash speed, which is always really cool. Hallowed Burial and Terminus actually put creatures and permanents on the bottom of their owner's libraries, so like I said, those pesky graveyard players can't run to their graveyards and recast all their stuff. But yeah, mono white is really just known for these kind of effects. And lastly, I wanted to talk about 2 cards. These are just kind of like the random cards, but first we're going to talk about Rest in Peace. Pretty famous white card. It's really good in any white deck, because we're not playing with our graveyard a whole lot and other strategies might rely on it. So Rest in Peace, when it enters, it's going to exile all graveyards, and if a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. And that's really important, because if someone has an effect that says, sacrifice a creature, draw a card, and I'm going to sacrifice my token, and the token doesn't hit the graveyard. So Rest in Peace doesn't just exile all graveyards, it prevents things from going to the graveyard, and is a really important piece in mono white strategies. So I might have talked about more board wipes than I did the target removal, and honestly that's just mono white for you. Mono white gives us multiple choices to exile or remove creatures, artifacts, or enchantments, and then on top of being excellent at handling one or more things, white gives us the ability to reset the game with a well-timed board wipe, and whether that's creatures or things like all non-land permanents. But now that we can remove anything, we can draw cards, and we have our lands secured, we need to talk about ways that mono white can win the game. So the first card I want to talk about is the newest card that was spoiled for Wilds of Eldraine, I believe. It is the Moonshaker Cavalry, which will be the mono white Craterhoof for years to come. It's a 6/6 with flying for 5 white, so 8 mana in total. When Moonshaker Cavalry enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and XX, where X is the number of creatures you control. So literally just white Craterhoof with flying instead of trample. Next is probably one of the most saltiest win cons that mono white has, which is Approach of the Second Sun. So for 6 white, you get a sorcery. If this spell was cast from your hand, and you've casted another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach of the Second Sun onto its opponent's library 7th from the top, and you gain 7 life. So it makes sure to keep us in the game, and it just has that text, you win the game. I probably wouldn't play with this card, but I know that some people do. Next is Angel of Destiny, 5 mana for a 2/6, flying and double strike. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each gain that much life. So it's kind of weird, it gives lifelink to everything you have, and it lets your opponents gain life off of your attacks. But at the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 life more than your starting life total, each player Angel of Destiny attacked this turn loses the game. So Angel of Destiny does trigger when it enters. It doesn't need to attack to give that little lifelink ability, but it does need to attack to make an opponent lose the game. So if you can give Myriad to this thing, maybe you could just win the game on the spot. Next up is Achroma's Will. I am a big fan of this card. I've used this card to win so many games. It's a 4-mana instant. Choose one. If you control your commander, you can choose both. You can either choose creatures you control gain Flying, Vigilance, Double Strike, or creatures you control gain Lifelink, Indestructible, and Protection from all colors. Basically, if you do this with a big enough board and you have your commander out, you're winning the game hands down. Achroma's Will is insane. Next up, I'm actually going to talk about 2 cards, which is Test of Endurance and Felidar Sovereign. These cards do a lot of things regarding your life total. So the test says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 50 or more life, you win the game. We start at 40, so we only need to gain 10 more. And Felidar Sovereign, Vigilance, and Lifelink. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 40 or more life, you win the game. So if you can cheat this out on turn 1, I don't know how you're doing that in mono white. You cheat it out, you just win the game if you can have it survive until your next turn. And the last 2 cards are just going to be big beater cards that I see come out and they just sway a game so hard. First one is going to be True Conviction. So 3 white for an enchantment. Creatures you control have Double Strike and Lifelink. It just keeps us in the game with the Lifelink, and giving Double Strike to everything is insanely powerful. And last is Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite. 5 white Vigilance. Other creatures you control get +2/+2, and creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. I've seen this card used so much as a board wipe. It just clears out the smaller creatures and it buffs your whole board. You can usually swing in and make some really great attacks after Elesh Norn comes down. And some other areas that I like to address throughout my EDH decks is how does my deck interact with its own or others' graveyards. So we're going to talk about ways that mono white, even if it's pretty few, can interact with its own graveyard. So cards like Revelark Flying. When Revelark leaves the battlefield, return up to 2 target creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it does get them back, but they do have to be kind of weak. And Revelark has an evoke cost where it's 1 more than its casting cost. We have things like Karmic Guide, so protection from black. When Karmic Guide enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And then at the beginning of our next upkeep, if we pay the Echo cost, we get to keep the Karmic Guide, but if not, we lose the Karmic Guide and it dies. Things like Rhea Dawnbringer, so this is super hefty, but it's 6 white for 9, 4/6 flying. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, so we can start cheating mana cost. Next is the Argivian Find. For 1 mana, return target artifact or enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. We also have Ritual of Restoration. 1 white, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Breath of Life. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And Resurrection. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. All these are pretty self-explanatory. Lastly, I wanted to talk about Auramancer. It's not as effective as some of the other things on this list, but when it enters, we can return an enchantment, and it's a 2/2 body that we can use to block later. And the last 2 are going to be some White's most classic graveyard interaction spells. So the first one is going to be Sun Titan. You all know Sun Titan. You all love Sun Titan. You all should be putting Sun Titan in all your white decks. It's got Vigilance. It's a 6/6 for 6. When Sun Titan enters or attacks, we return target permanent card and converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. So that's creatures, lands, artifacts, enchantments. Sun Titan doesn't care. He wants you to have everything. Sun Titan is a good boy. And lastly, none of you are probably playing this card because of the price tag, but it's Replenish. So for 4 mana sorcery, return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. I just wanted to talk about this because it is something that hits all things in a graveyard, but I don't expect any of you to be playing this. And I think we've gone over the basics of deck building and how mono white can answer some of the most basic things that a deck needs to be proficient. But what about the cards that I didn't get around to talking about? Some of White's best cards that I don't think really fit into the general deck building checklist. We're going to take this time to go over some of White's other all-stars that fit into certain strategies. So first up, we're going to talk about Anointed Procession, the White doubling season. Notice how a lot of mono white cards, I always tend to say, this is White's Craterhoof, or this is White's Cultivate, this is White's doubling season. You know, White just has to apparently copy effects from other colors to be considered good. So the Anointed Procession is a 4 mana enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice as many of those tokens. So that's treasure tokens, clue tokens, creature tokens, anything as long as it's a token. the Wandering Emperor. This card's just pretty cool. So it's a planeswalker. It's got flash. You flash it in. You get to activate her loyalty abilities as though they had flash. So we can either put a +1 counter on a creature and it gains first strike, which can be useful. -2, -1, sorry, create a 2/2 white samurai with vigilance, and -2, exile target tapped creature, you gain 2 life. So this card is removal, it's token generation, and it's a little bit of trickery, because it's got flash and it can give a creature first strike. Next up is the White Plume Adventure, and get ready for another analogy. This is Mono White's Seedborn Muse. So when the White Plume Adventure enters the battlefield, we take the initiative, which you can look up on your own time. I'm not going to explain what the initiative is right now. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control. But if we've completed a dungeon, which is going to play into the initiative, then we can untap all creatures we control instead. So White Plume Adventure I have in my Rune of the Hidden Realms deck, which is a blink deck, so I can make sure to complete the dungeon without being devoted to having cards that allow me to move through the dungeon after I've taken the initiative. So unless you're completing dungeons, I don't know if this card is going to be amazing, but it can untap a creature. You know, let's say your commander has a tap ability, White Plume Adventure might be the card for you. Next up is Teferi's Protection, staple mono white card. Till your next turn, your life total can't change, you have protection from everything, all your permanents, and you phase out. So you just get out of the game real quick, and you come back on your next turn. This card is well known to just save lives and win games. And last up, we're just going to fire off these last 3 because they're kind of weird. You know, I see them a lot, I see them talked about a lot, and they're really good in mono white. So that's things like Ephemerate, Ghostly Prison, and Blind Obedience. Ephemerate's an instant. It can be used to protect our creatures if we need to, or it can be used to get some ETBs if we have any. So it exiles a creature we control, then returns it to the battlefield. Then it's got Rebound, so then at our upkeep we can just do that again. You know, hit our protect a creature if we know board wipe is coming or something like that. So having Rebound on it, it's 2 spells in 1 for only 1 mana. Ghostly Prison, creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 colorless mana for each creature attacking. Pretty good at just saving your life when there's people with huge boards out. And Blind Obedience, which is a card I feel like is not played enough. So it does have Extort, but remember that inside those parentheses, that reminder text that says white-black isn't actually part of the card's color identity. So Extort should just be by itself. Those parentheses are just there to remind us that the Extort ability can be paid with either white or black, but it does not give black to the color identity of Blind Obedience. So artifacts and creatures enter the battlefield tapped for our opponents. So this is really nice. So mana rocks enter tapped and creatures enter tapped. Blind Obedience being only 2 mana, we can drain and gain life with the Extort, and it slows all of our opponents down. Blind Obedience can be super good. It's really cheap for an effect like this. You know, you'd expect to pay a little bit more mana, but it being so cheap with a couple of really strong effects is why I would always put it in a mono white deck. So I think after going through all of that, all of what white has to offer, we can see that white actually has a lot of ways to answer the basics of deck building. So we can ramp out extra lands, even though it's much harder to do so. We can find ways to draw extra cards. We have an excellent suite of target removal and board wiping abilities, along with some great game-ending cards. Mono White seems to contain a lot of sweet answers to a lot of EDH's questions, but doesn't seem to contain the consistency that a more experienced player would become accustomed to. So white seems to be exclusively used as a complementary color to the 3 more powerful colors, being blue, black, and green. Blue-white offers us a ton of options for control and counter spells. White-black gives us access to the Aristocrat, Sacrifice, Drain and Gain style of deck, and green-white offers us multiple ways to ramp out lands so we can hit our big effects, big spells, and big creatures. And honestly, we don't talk about white-red. So there you have it. White is a powerful color and probably contains more answers than you think to be completely viable to stand on its own without the support of the other colors. If white is your favorite color in EDH, make sure to drop a comment down below with some of your favorite white cards and who your mono white commander is. And remember, I am your friendly white mage, Azoreign. And thanks for watching.